In the shadowed corridors of Ravenshollow Manor, where secrets festered like wounds beneath gilded surfaces, a single utterance would shatter the carefully constructed lies of England's most powerful duke. When young Mary Whitmore, a mere kitchen servant, dared to speak 4 words that would expose a decades-old deception, she unknowingly sealed her family's fate. The Duke of Ravenshollow's immediate response was swift and merciless: imprisonment for the entire Whitmore clan. But what Mary possessed was more than just knowledge. It was proof of a crime that could topple the very foundations of aristocratic power. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. The autumn of 1887 painted Ravenshollow Manor in shades of amber and crimson, its Gothic spires piercing the Yorkshire moors like accusatory fingers against the pewter sky. Within its stone walls, 18-year-old Lady Catherine Ashworth moved through her prescribed existence with the grace expected of a duke's ward. Yet her emerald eyes held a restlessness that no amount of deportment lessons could quell. "Stand straighter, Catherine," commanded the Dowager Duchess Beatrice, her silver-topped cane tapping against the marble floor of the morning room. "The Duke of Ravenshollow expects perfection from his future daughter-in-law." Catherine's spine stiffened, though not entirely from obedience. The mention of her betrothal to Lord Edmund Blackthorne, heir to the Ravenshollow dukedom, sent familiar tendrils of dread curling through her chest. At 26, Edmund possessed the classical features that graced oil paintings throughout the manor's galleries, yet his pale blue eyes held a coldness that made Catherine's skin crawl. "Yes, Your Grace," Catherine murmured, her fingers unconsciously twisting the simple silver locket at her throat, the only memento of her deceased parents, killed in a carriage accident when she was merely 5 years old. The great hall buzzed with preparation for the upcoming engagement ball, where Catherine's fate would be sealed before 300 of England's most influential families. Servants scurried about like industrious ants, polishing silver until it gleamed like captured starlight, and arranging hothouse flowers that cost more than most families earned in a year. Among these servants moved Mary Whitmore, a girl of Catherine's own age, whose auburn hair caught the light filtering through the stained glass windows. Mary had served at Ravenshollow since childhood, her family having worked the estate for generations. Unlike Catherine, Mary possessed a freedom that came from invisibility. She could speak her mind to the other servants, laugh without restraint, and dream of a future beyond these walls. "The young lady looks pale as morning mist," Mary whispered to Mrs. Hartwell, the head housekeeper, as they observed Catherine's rigid posture during her piano lesson. Mrs. Hartwell, a woman whose weathered face had witnessed decades of aristocratic secrets, merely shook her head. "Some cages are made of gold, child, but they're cages nonetheless." Edmund Blackthorne arrived that afternoon in a carriage bearing the Ravenshollow coat of arms, a raven clutching a thorned rose. How fitting, Catherine thought bitterly. He swept into the drawing-room with the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything, his dark hair perfectly pomaded and his tailored coat speaking of London's finest establishments. "My dear Catherine," he said, lifting her gloved hand to his lips in a gesture that felt more possessive than romantic. "You grow more beautiful each time I see you." His words were honey over poison, sweet on the surface, but carrying an undertone that made Catherine's stomach clench. She had learned to read the subtle signs, the way his grip lingered too long, the calculating gleam in his eyes when he thought no one was watching, the cruel twist of his mouth when servants made minor mistakes. "You honor me, my lord," Catherine replied, the practiced response falling from her lips like autumn leaves, beautiful but lifeless. That evening, as Catherine prepared for dinner, Mary entered her chambers carrying fresh linens. The servant girl's presence always brought a measure of comfort, perhaps because Mary treated her as a person rather than a prize to be won. "Begging your pardon, my lady," Mary said softly, "but you seem troubled." Catherine turned from her vanity mirror, where her reflection showed a young woman trapped between childhood and a future she didn't choose. Do you ever wonder, Mary, what it would be like to choose your own path? Mary's brown eyes sparkled with understanding. Every day, my lady, but perhaps some paths choose us instead. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Edmund, who entered without knocking, a presumption that spoke volumes about his character. His gaze swept over Mary with the dismissive coldness reserved for furniture, before settling on Catherine with predatory satisfaction. "Leave us," he commanded Mary, who curtsied and departed, but not before Catherine caught the flash of concern in her eyes. "Catherine, my dear," Edmund began, moving closer than propriety dictated, "I trust you understand the honor being bestowed upon you. The Raven's Hollow name is not given lightly." "Of course, my lord," Catherine replied, stepping back until her spine pressed against the window frame. "Good," he said, his smile never reaching his eyes, "because I would hate for there to be any misunderstandings about your position in this arrangement. You are to be my wife, which means you belong to me in every sense of the word." The threat in his voice was unmistakable, wrapped though it was in silk and social convention. Catherine felt the familiar weight of helplessness settle over her shoulders like a burial shroud. As Edmund finally departed, leaving behind the cloying scent of his cologne, Catherine pressed her forehead against the cool glass of her window. Below, in the servants' courtyard, she could see Mary hanging laundry, her movements free and purposeful. How strange that a servant girl possessed more liberty than a duke's ward. The engagement ball was set for the following Saturday, just 5 days away. 5 days until Catherine would be irrevocably bound to a man whose very presence made her soul recoil. 5 days until her life would become a performance with no intermission, no escape, no hope of genuine happiness. But fate, as Mary had suggested, sometimes chose its own paths. And in the depths of Raven's Hollow Manor, secrets stirred like sleeping dragons, waiting for the right moment to breathe fire upon the carefully constructed lies that held the Blackthorn dynasty together. What Catherine didn't know was that Mary Whitmore carried more than just linens and cleaning supplies through the manor's corridors. She carried a truth that would soon shatter everything the Duke of Ravenshollow held dear. The morning of the engagement ball dawned with an ominous beauty, the Yorkshire sky painted in shades of pearl and rose that seemed to mock Catherine's inner turmoil. Ravenshollow Manor had been transformed into a glittering showcase of aristocratic power, with crystal chandeliers casting rainbow prisms across walls adorned with centuries of Blackthorn portraits. Stern-faced ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to judge all who passed beneath their gaze. Catherine stood before her bedroom mirror as her lady's maid, Agnes, fastened the final pearl buttons on her gown, a creation of ivory silk and Belgian lace that had cost more than most families saw in a lifetime. The dress was undeniably beautiful, yet it felt like a shroud, each delicate stitch binding her more tightly to a fate she despised. "You look like an angel, my lady," Agnes whispered, her weathered hands gentle as she arranged Catherine's auburn curls into an elaborate coiffure adorned with her grandmother's diamond tiara. "Angels have wings, Agnes," Catherine replied softly, her reflection showing a young woman whose beauty was overshadowed by the sadness in her emerald eyes. "I fear I'm more akin to a bird in a cage." Below stairs, the servants worked with military precision under Mrs. Hartwell's watchful eye. Mary Whitmore moved through the great hall, adjusting flower arrangements and ensuring every surface gleamed with perfection. Her simple black dress and white apron marked her station clearly, yet there was a dignity in her bearing that spoke of inner strength. As Mary polished the silver serving pieces in the butler's pantry, she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Through the partially open door, she could see Edmund Blackthorn speaking with his cousin, Lord Reginald Ashworth, a man whose reputation for cruelty was whispered about in London's darkest corners. "The girl is proving more spirited than anticipated," Edmund was saying, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a man discussing livestock. "But no matter. Once we're wed, I'll break her of such notions quickly enough." Reginald laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your father's methods have always been effective. Remember what happened to the last servant who dared question the family's business dealings?" "Indeed," Edmund replied coldly. "The Whitmore family learned their place well enough after that incident. Sometimes a reminder of one's position is necessary." Mary's hands trembled as she continued her work, her mind racing. The Whitmore family, her family, had indeed suffered a mysterious setback years ago when her father had questioned certain financial irregularities in the estate's accounts. He had been dismissed without reference, forcing them into poverty until the Duke had magnanimously allowed them to return to service, though at reduced wages and under constant scrutiny. As evening approached, carriages began arriving in a steady stream, their occupants emerging like exotic birds in their finery. The cream of English society had come to witness Catherine's engagement. Dukes and duchesses, earls and countesses, members of Parliament, and even a minor royal cousin whose presence lent additional prestige to the occasion. Catherine descended the grand staircase at precisely 8 o'clock, her hand resting lightly on the banister as 300 pairs of eyes turned toward her. The murmur of approval that rippled through the crowd should have been gratifying, yet it felt more like the appreciative sounds of buyers at a horse auction. Edmund waited at the bottom of the stairs, resplendent in his evening dress, his dark hair gleaming under the chandelier light. He offered his arm with a smile that never reached his pale eyes, and Catherine had no choice but to accept it, feeling the possessive strength of his grip even through her long gloves. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the Duke of Ravenshollow, his voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd, "it is my great pleasure to formally announce the engagement of my son, Lord Edmund Blackthorne, to Lady Catherine Ashworth." The applause was thunderous, yet Catherine felt as though she were drowning in it. She smiled and nodded graciously as guest after guest offered their congratulations, each word of praise feeling like another link in the chain that bound her to this unwanted future. The evening progressed with clockwork precision. Dinner was served in the state dining room, where Catherine sat at Edmund's right hand like a beautiful ornament, speaking when spoken to and smiling until her face ached. The conversation flowed around her like a river she couldn't enter, discussions of politics and society that excluded her as surely as if she were invisible. It was during the dancing that Mary's world and Catherine's began to unravel. Mary had been serving champagne to the guests when she noticed Lady Pemberton, an elderly dowager known for her extensive jewellery collection, examining Catherine's locket with unusual interest. The old woman's face had gone pale, and she was whispering urgently to her companion, Lady Worthington. "That locket," Lady Pemberton was saying, her voice barely audible above the orchestra. "I would swear it belonged to dear Margaret Ashworth. I remember it distinctly. It was a wedding gift from her mother." Mary's blood turned to ice. Margaret Ashworth, Catherine's mother, had died in that carriage accident 18 years ago. But Mary knew something that made Lady Pemberton's observation impossible to dismiss. She knew because her own mother, Sarah Whitmore, had been Margaret Ashworth's lady's maid, and had been in the carriage that terrible night. Her mother had survived, barely, and had spoken of strange circumstances surrounding the accident in her delirium. She had mentioned the locket, claimed that Lady Margaret had pressed it into her hands with desperate words about protecting Catherine. But when Sarah had tried to return it to the Duke, he had flown into a rage, claiming the locket had been destroyed in the accident and that Sarah's injuries had confused her memory. Mary's hands shook as she continued serving, her mind reeling with implications. If the locket had survived, if her mother's memories were true, then what else about that night had been a lie? As the evening reached its crescendo, the Duke called for silence to make the formal announcement of the engagement terms. Catherine stood beside Edmund, her face a mask of composure, even as her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. "My friends," the Duke began, his voice resonating with authority. "Tonight we celebrate not merely an engagement, but the joining of two great families. The Ashworth legacy will live on through this union, ensuring that their noble bloodline continues through the Blackthorn name." It was then that Mary made a decision that would change everything. Perhaps it was the sight of Catherine's barely concealed despair, or the memory of her mother's dying words about truth and justice, or simply the accumulated weight of years of watching the powerful crush the innocent. Whatever the reason, Mary stepped forward from her position along the wall. "Your Grace," she said, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a blade through silk. The Duke turned, his face darkening with displeasure at being interrupted by a servant. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" Mary's heart pounded so hard she was certain everyone could hear it, but she pressed on. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but I must speak. That locket Lady Catherine wears. My mother has that ring." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of confusion and shock. Catherine's hand flew instinctively to her throat, her fingers closing around the silver locket that had been her only connection to her lost parents. "What ring?" the Duke demanded, his voice dangerously quiet. Mary's voice grew stronger, fueled by 18 years of suppressed truth. "The ring that matches that locket, Your Grace. My mother, Sarah Whitmore, was Lady Margaret Ashworth's maid. She was in the carriage that night, and Lady Margaret gave her the ring before she died, begging her to keep it safe for Lady Catherine. My mother has worn it every day since, hidden beneath her clothes, waiting for the right time to return it to its rightful owner." The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine stared at Mary in shock, her mind struggling to process the implications. If Mary's mother had been in the carriage, if she had survived when everyone believed there were no survivors except Catherine herself. Edmund's face had gone white with rage, while the Duke's expression was thunderous. The assembled guests whispered among themselves, sensing scandal but not yet understanding its magnitude. "Seize her!" the Duke commanded, his voice cutting through the murmur like a whip crack. "Seize the entire Whitmore family. They are thieves and liars, attempting to extort money from this family with fabricated tales." But even as the Duke's men moved to obey, Lady Pemberton stepped forward, her aged voice carrying clearly across the room. "Wait," she commanded, with the authority of her 70 years and impeccable reputation. "I knew Margaret Ashworth well, and I remember that ring. If what this girl says is true, then there are questions that must be answered." The Duke's face was a mask of barely controlled fury, but he could not openly defy Lady Pemberton without causing a scandal that would destroy his reputation. "Very well," he said through gritted teeth. "We shall investigate these wild claims. But until then, the Whitmore family will be confined to prevent them from spreading more lies." As the Duke's men surrounded Mary, she looked directly at Catherine, her brown eyes blazing with desperate courage. "The truth will come out, my lady," she said clearly. "My mother kept her promise to yours, and now I'm keeping mine to you." Catherine watched in horror as Mary was led away, her mind reeling with questions that demanded answers. What promise? What truth had been hidden for 18 years? And why did the Duke look like a man whose darkest secrets were about to be exposed? The engagement ball continued, but the celebration had turned hollow, the laughter forced, and the conversation strained. Catherine moved through the remainder of the evening like a sleepwalker, her thoughts consumed by Mary's words and the growing certainty that her entire life had been built upon a foundation of lies. As the last guests departed and the manor settled into an uneasy quiet, Catherine stood alone in her chamber, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The beautiful gown now felt like a costume, the diamond tiara like a crown of thorns. But it was the simple silver locket at her throat that held her attention, its familiar weight now carrying the promise of secrets yet to be revealed. What had really happened the night her parents died? And what truth was worth imprisoning an entire family to keep hidden? The dawn, following the disastrous engagement ball, broke grey and cheerless over Ravenshollow Manor, as if the very sky mourned the injustice that had unfolded beneath its ancient stones. Catherine had not slept. Instead, she had spent the long hours pacing her chamber like a caged lioness, her mind churning with Mary's revelations and the Duke's violent reaction to them. The Whitmore family had been dragged from their modest cottage on the estate grounds in the dead of night, and imprisoned in the manor's old dungeons, stone cells that hadn't been used since the medieval period, but which the Duke had ordered restored for this very purpose. The official story, already spreading through the servants' quarters like wildfire, was that they had been caught stealing family heirlooms and attempting to blackmail the Duke with fabricated stories. But Catherine knew better. She had seen the terror in the Duke's eyes when Mary spoke of the ring, had witnessed the way Edmund's face had drained of colour. Whatever secret the Whitmore family possessed, it was dangerous enough to warrant imprisonment without trial, without even the pretence of proper investigation that the Duke had promised Lady Pemberton. As Catherine dressed in a simple morning gown of deep blue wool, her hands trembled with more than just the morning chill. Every instinct screamed that she was in danger, that the same fate awaiting the Whitmores could easily befall her if she asked too many questions. Yet how could she remain silent when an innocent family suffered for protecting what might be her own heritage? A soft knock at her door interrupted her troubled thoughts. "Enter," she called, expecting Agnes with her morning tea. Instead, a woman Catherine had never seen before stepped into the room. Tall and elegant, with silver-streaked auburn hair and intelligent grey eyes that seemed to see everything. She wore a travelling dress of excellent quality but practical design, and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. "Lady Catherine," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight Scottish accent, "I am Lady Moira Sinclair, your mother's sister. I've come to take you away from this place." "Ah," Catherine stared in shock. "My mother's sister, but I was told I had no living relatives." Lady Moira's expression hardened. "You were told many lies, my dear. Your mother Margaret was my younger sister, and I have been searching for the truth of her death for 18 years. Last night's events have convinced me that the time for subtlety has passed." But how did you—" "Lady Pemberton is an old friend," Moira explained, moving to Catherine's wardrobe and beginning to select items with practiced efficiency. "She sent word immediately after the ball. Pack only what you cannot bear to leave behind. We leave within the hour." Catherine's mind reeled. "I cannot simply leave. The Duke is my guardian, and I am engaged to Lord Edmund. There are legal obligations." "Legal obligations built upon fraud and murder," Moira said sharply, then softened her tone at Catherine's gasp. "Forgive me, child. I know this is overwhelming, but your mother was my dearest friend as well as my sister, and I know she did not die in any accident." As if summoned by their conversation, heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Moira moved swiftly to the window, her expression grim. "The Duke's men. They've come to ensure you cannot leave or ask inconvenient questions." The door burst open without ceremony, revealing Edmund flanked by 2 burly footmen. His usually immaculate appearance was dishevelled, his pale eyes wild with barely controlled rage. "Catherine," he said, his voice deceptively calm, "you will not be receiving any visitors today, or any day for that matter, until this unpleasant business is resolved." Lord Edmund," Moira said coolly, stepping between him and Catherine, "I am Lady Moira Sinclair, Catherine's aunt. I have come to escort my niece to my estate in Scotland for a period of recovery from last night's distressing events." Edmund's laugh was harsh and ugly. How convenient. Another supposed relative appearing just when the family faces scandal. "I think not, madam. Catherine remains here, under my protection." "Your protection?" Moira's voice could have frozen fire. "Is that what you call imprisoning innocent servants and threatening a young woman who has committed no crime?" "The servants are thieves and blackmailers," Edmund snarled. "And Catherine is my betrothed. She goes nowhere without my permission." It was then that Catherine found her voice, strengthened by 18 years of suppressed rebellion and the sight of someone finally standing up to the Blackthorn tyranny. "I am not your property, Edmund. If Lady Sinclair is indeed my aunt, then I choose to go with her." Edmund's mask of civility finally slipped completely. "You choose nothing," he hissed, stepping closer with menace in every line of his body. "You are mine by right of guardianship and betrothal. You will marry me, bear my children, and never speak of last night's nonsense again. The Whitmore family will disappear, and life will continue as planned." "Over my dead body," Moira said quietly, and something in her tone made even Edmund pause. "I am not some powerless servant you can intimidate, boy. I am the Countess of Glenmore, with connections that reach to the highest levels of government and society. Touch one hair on my niece's head, and I will bring the full weight of Scottish law and English justice down upon this house." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, until the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the tension. Through the window, Catherine could see a carriage bearing the royal coat of arms, pulling up the manor's drive. Edmund cursed under his breath. "Lady Pemberton," he muttered, "the meddling old witch has brought reinforcements." Indeed, Lady Pemberton emerged from the royal carriage, accompanied by a stern-faced gentleman in official dress and 2 uniformed constables. Behind them came another carriage, from which stepped a man Catherine didn't recognize, tall and lean, with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "It appears," Moira said with satisfaction, "that the cavalry has arrived. Catherine, gather your things. We're leaving." But Edmund wasn't finished. "You think you've won?" he snarled. "You know nothing of what you're interfering with. The Ashworth fortune, the estate, everything Catherine believes is hers. It all belongs to the Blackthorn family now. She is nothing without us, nothing but a penniless orphan with delusions of grandeur." "Then you won't mind releasing her from the engagement," Moira replied smoothly. "After all, why would the heir to a dukedom want to marry a penniless orphan?" Edmund's face flushed purple with rage, but before he could respond, voices echoed from the main hall below. Lady Pemberton's imperious tones carried clearly. "I demand to see the Duke immediately, and I want those servants released from whatever medieval dungeon you've stuffed them into." Within minutes, the official party had reached Catherine's chambers. The stern gentleman introduced himself as Inspector Morrison from Scotland Yard, while the unknown man proved to be Dr. James Hartwell, a physician and legal advocate who specialized in cases of wrongful imprisonment. "Lady Catherine," Inspector Morrison said formally, "we have received serious allegations regarding the circumstances of your parents' death and your subsequent guardianship. Until these matters can be properly investigated, you are free to leave with Lady Sinclair if you so choose." "This is preposterous," Edmund protested. "You have no authority here." "On the contrary," Dr. Hartwell said mildly, producing an official-looking document, "we have a writ from the High Court authorizing this investigation. The Whitmore family is to be released immediately, and Lady Catherine is free to go where she pleases." As the officials departed to oversee the release of the Whitmores, Moira helped Catherine pack her few precious belongings, her mother's jewelry, some favorite books, and the clothes that truly belonged to her rather than the Duke's charity. "Where are we going?" Catherine asked as they prepared to leave. "To my estate in the Scottish Highlands," Moira replied. "Glenmore Castle has been in our family for 4 centuries. It's where your mother grew up, where she was happy before she married your father and moved to England. It's where you can learn the truth about who you really are." As their carriage pulled away from Ravenshollow Manor, Catherine looked back at the only home she had ever known. The Gothic towers seemed less imposing now, more like the crumbling remnants of a dying dynasty than symbols of eternal power. "What will happen to the Whitmores?" she asked. "Dr. Hartwell will ensure they're properly cared for," Moira assured her. "And Sarah Whitmore will finally be able to tell her story without fear. The ring she's carried all these years. It's more than just a piece of jewelry, Catherine. It's proof of your mother's true wishes and evidence of the Duke's crimes. Indeed, the journey to Scotland took 3 days, during which Moira gradually revealed the truth about Catherine's family. The Sinclairs were indeed wealthy and influential, with estates spanning thousands of acres and investments in everything from shipping to railways. Margaret Ashworth had not been the penniless orphan the Duke claimed, but the daughter of a proud Scottish clan with a fortune that rivaled the Blackthorns' own. "Your mother fell in love with your father at a London ball," Moira explained, as their carriage wound through the heather-covered hills of the Highlands. "Thomas Ashworth was a good man, honest and kind, but he had no head for business. When they married, Margaret's dowry became part of the Ashworth estate, managed by the Duke as Thomas's older brother. And when they died, Moira's expression grew grim. The Duke claimed the estate was bankrupt, that your parents had squandered their inheritance. He presented forged documents showing massive debts and convinced the courts that taking you as his ward was an act of charity. But Margaret had written to me just weeks before her death, expressing concerns about missing funds and the Duke's increasingly erratic behavior. As Glenmore Castle came into view, a magnificent structure of grey stone rising from the moors like something from a fairy tale, Catherine felt a strange sense of homecoming. This was where her mother had run through corridors as a child, where she had learned to ride and read and dream of her future. "Dr. Hartwell will join us in a few days," Moira said, as they approached the castle gates. "He's bringing Sarah Whitmore and her family, along with all the evidence they've gathered. It's time the world learned what really happened 18 years ago." That evening, as Catherine stood on the battlements of Glenmore Castle, looking out over the wild beauty of the Scottish Highlands, she felt something she had never experienced at Ravenshollow Manor: freedom. The wind whipped through her unbound hair, and for the first time in her life she could breathe without feeling the weight of others' expectations crushing her spirit. But even as she revelled in her newfound liberty, Catherine knew this was only the beginning. Somewhere in the evidence Sarah Whitmore had preserved, in the documents Dr. Hartwell was gathering, lay the truth about her parents' death and the Duke's crimes. And with that truth would come the power to not only free herself from Edmund's unwanted attentions, but to ensure that justice was finally served. The girl who had descended the stairs at Ravenshollow Manor just days ago, beautiful, compliant and trapped, was gone forever. In her place stood a young woman who had tasted freedom and would never again allow herself to be caged, no matter how golden the bars might be. What secrets would Sarah Whitmore's ring reveal, and how far would the Duke go to keep his crimes buried? Dr. James Hartwell arrived at Glenmore Castle on a crisp October morning, accompanied by the entire Whitmore family and a leather satchel that would prove to contain the keys to 18 years of buried truth. Catherine watched from the castle's great hall windows as their carriage wound up the mountain path, her heart racing with anticipation and dread in equal measure. Sarah Whitmore emerged from the carriage like a woman stepping out of a long nightmare into daylight. Though only in her 40s, the years of carrying terrible secrets had etched lines of worry around her eyes and streaked her brown hair with premature silver. Yet there was a dignity in her bearing that no amount of servitude could diminish, and when she looked up at the castle windows, Catherine saw a flash of the courage that had sustained her through nearly 2 decades of silence. Mary followed her mother, her auburn hair catching the Highland sun like burnished copper. The ordeal of imprisonment had left her pale but unbroken, and when her eyes met Catherine's through the glass, both young women shared a moment of understanding that transcended the social barriers that had once divided them. "Come," Lady Moira said gently, placing a hand on Catherine's shoulder. "It's time you heard the truth about the night your parents died." The great hall of Glenmore Castle had witnessed centuries of clan gatherings, but perhaps none more momentous than this. Ancient tapestries depicting Scottish victories hung from stone walls, while a massive fireplace cast dancing shadows across the assembled group. Catherine sat in a chair that had once belonged to her mother, while Sarah Whitmore faced her across a heavy oak table that had served the Sinclair family for generations. Dr. Hartwell, a man whose gentle manner belied his reputation as one of London's most formidable legal advocates, opened his satchel with the reverence of a priest handling sacred relics. "Before we begin," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "I want everyone to understand that what we discuss here today will likely result in criminal charges against some of England's most powerful men. Are you all prepared for the consequences of that truth?" Sarah Whitmore straightened her shoulders. "I've been prepared for 18 years, sir. I made a promise to my dying mistress, and I mean to keep it." "Then let us begin with the night of November 15th, 1869, Dr. Hartwell said, consulting his notes. Lady Margaret Ashworth, her husband Thomas, and their 5-year-old daughter Catherine were travelling from London to their estate in Yorkshire. With them was Lady Margaret's maid, Sarah Whitmore. The official report states that the carriage overturned during a storm, killing both Lord and Lady Ashworth instantly, while their daughter survived with minor injuries. No mention was made of any surviving servants. "Because they wanted me dead too," Sarah said quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "But God had other plans." Catherine leaned forward, her heart pounding. "Tell me what really happened, Sarah. Please." Sarah's eyes grew distant, as if she were seeing that terrible night all over again. "Your mother had been frightened for weeks before we left London, my lady. She'd discovered irregularities in the estate accounts, money missing, forged documents, debts that didn't exist. She'd confronted the Duke about it, and he'd flown into a rage, claiming she was hysterical and didn't understand business matters. But she did understand," Lady Moira interjected. "Margaret was brilliant with numbers. Our father had taught both his daughters to manage money because he believed women should never be helpless in financial matters." Sarah nodded. "Lady Margaret had been gathering evidence, copying documents, preparing to take legal action. She'd written to you, Lady Moira, asking you to come to London, but before you could arrive—" "The accident," Catherine whispered. "It was no accident," Sarah said firmly. "The carriage was sabotaged. I saw the Duke's men tampering with the wheels that morning, though I didn't understand what they were doing at the time. When we set out that evening, your mother was carrying a leather portfolio containing all her evidence, along with her jewellery and important papers." Dr. Hartwell produced a small object from his satchel, a silver ring set with a sapphire that matched Catherine's locket perfectly. "This ring?" Sarah's breath caught. "Yes. Lady Margaret pressed it into my hands as she lay dying in the wreckage. She made me swear to keep it safe for Catherine, along with the truth about what really happened. She said the ring and locket together would prove Catherine's true inheritance." Catherine stared at the ring, her vision blurring with tears. "What did she mean?" "The ring contains a hidden compartment, Dr. Hartwell explained, demonstrating a tiny mechanism that opened to reveal a rolled piece of parchment no bigger than a child's fingernail. "Inside is a miniature copy of your mother's will, written in her own hand and witnessed by 2 London solicitors. It names you as the sole heir to the Sinclair fortune she brought to her marriage, and it explicitly states that the Duke is to have no control over your inheritance." The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet, as though everything she had believed about her life had been revealed as an elaborate lie. "But how did you survive?" Lady Moira asked Sarah gently. "If they meant to kill you too?" Sarah's voice grew stronger, fueled by years of suppressed anger. "I was thrown clear when the carriage overturned, but I was badly injured and unconscious. They must have assumed I was dead and left me there. A passing farmer found me hours later and took me to his cottage. By the time I recovered enough to speak, the Duke had already told everyone that there were no survivors except little Catherine." "And you said nothing for 18 years?" Dr. Hartwell asked. "What could I say?" Sarah's voice broke slightly. "I was a servant with no proof except a ring and a dying woman's words. The Duke was one of the most powerful men in England. Who would have believed me? And he made it clear what would happen to my family if I spoke out. Mary spoke for the first time, her young voice fierce with indignation. He threatened us constantly. Any time my mother seemed like she might speak up about anything, he would remind her of her place and what happened to servants who forgot it. Catherine rose from her chair and walked to the great windows overlooking the Highland moors. The vast expanse of heather and sky seemed to mirror the enormity of what she had just learned. "So I am not penniless," she said slowly. "I am not dependent on the Duke's charity. I never was." "On the contrary," Dr. Hartwell said, consulting another document. "According to my calculations, you are one of the wealthiest young women in Britain. The Sinclair fortune, properly invested over the past 18 years, would be worth approximately £200,000. The sum was staggering, enough to buy a dozen estates like Ravenshollow Manor, enough to live in luxury for several lifetimes. But more than the money, it was the knowledge that her parents had not left her helpless that made Catherine's heart sore. "There's more," Lady Moira said quietly. "Show her the letters, Dr. Hartwell." From his seemingly bottomless satchel, the doctor produced a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon. "These were hidden in your mother's jewelry box, which Sarah managed to save from the wreckage. They're love letters from your father, but they also contain detailed accounts of the Duke's financial crimes. Thomas Ashworth may not have been a businessman, but he was an honest man who kept meticulous records." As Catherine read her father's elegant handwriting, a picture emerged of systematic theft spanning years. The Duke had been embezzling from the Ashworth estate almost from the moment of her parents' marriage, using forged documents and false debts to cover his tracks. When her mother had begun to investigate, he had seen murder as his only option to prevent exposure. "We have enough evidence to see him hanged," Dr. Hartwell said grimly. "The question is what you want to do with it." Before Catherine could answer, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the moors. From the windows, they could see a large party of riders approaching the castle, at least a dozen men in the dark clothing of London solicitors and investigators. "Edmund," Lady Moira said grimly. "I wondered how long it would take him to track us down." Indeed, Lord Edmund Blackthorne rode at the head of the group, his face a mask of cold fury. Beside him rode his father, the Duke of Ravenshollow, looking every inch the powerful aristocrat despite the circumstances. Behind them came a collection of lawyers, investigators, and what appeared to be hired muscle, disguised as servants. "They've come to silence us," Sarah whispered, her face pale with fear. "Let them come," Catherine said, and there was steel in her voice that had never been there before. "I am not the frightened girl who left Ravenshollow Manor. I am Catherine Sinclair, daughter of Margaret and Thomas, and I am done being afraid." "Mail." The confrontation took place in the castle's courtyard, with the ancient stones bearing witness to a battle that would determine the fate of two great families. Edmund dismounted with theatrical flourish, his pale eyes scanning the assembled group with predatory calculation. "Catherine," he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard with false warmth, "you've led us quite a chase, but this foolishness has gone on long enough. It's time to come home." "This is my home," Catherine replied, standing tall on the castle steps with Lady Moira beside her, "and you are not welcome here." The Duke stepped forward, his presence commanding even in these foreign surroundings. "Lady Sinclair," he said with a slight bow, "I appreciate your concern for my ward, but Catherine is legally bound to return with us. She is engaged to my son and has responsibilities she cannot simply abandon." "Your ward?" Lady Moira's laugh was sharp as Highland wind. "She was never your ward, Blackthorne. You murdered her parents and stole her inheritance. The only thing you're legally bound for is the gallows." Edmund's mask finally slipped completely. "You have no proof of these wild accusations. The ravings of a servant and the fantasies of a bitter spinster will not stand up in any court." "Won't they?" Dr. Hartwell stepped forward, his mild manner unchanged, despite the tension crackling through the air. I think you'll find that the courts are very interested in cases of murder and theft, regardless of the social standing of the accused. It was then that Catherine made her choice. She descended the castle steps slowly, her head held high, until she stood face to face with the man who had controlled her life for 18 years. "Edmund," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtyard, "I release you from our engagement. I'm sure you'll find someone more suitable, perhaps someone who actually wants to marry you." Edmund's face flushed purple with rage. "You cannot release me from anything. You are nothing without the Blackthorn name, nothing but a penniless orphan with delusions of grandeur." "Then why do you want to marry me so desperately?" Catherine asked sweetly. "If I'm truly worthless, surely you can find a better match elsewhere." The question hung in the air like a sword, and Catherine saw the moment when Edmund realized he had been trapped by his own words. If he admitted she had value, he admitted there was something worth stealing. If he maintained she was worthless, he had no reason to pursue the marriage. "Because," the Duke said coldly, stepping into the breach, "honor demands it. The engagement was made in good faith and it will be honored." "Honor?" Sarah Whitmore stepped forward, her voice ringing with 18 years of suppressed truth. "You speak of honor, Your Grace. Then explain this." She held up the silver ring, its sapphire catching the Highland sun like a captured star. "Explain how a ring that was supposedly destroyed in a carriage accident came to be in my possession. Explain how I survived that night when your official report claimed there were no survivors. Explain how you've spent 18 years stealing from an orphaned child." The Duke's composure cracked for just a moment, and in that crack, Catherine saw the truth of his guilt, written as clearly as if it had been carved in stone. "Guards," the Duke commanded, "arrest these people for theft and conspiracy." But his men hesitated, looking uncertainly at the Scottish soil beneath their feet and the grim-faced Highlanders who had appeared on the castle walls. They were far from England now, far from the Duke's power and influence. "I think not," said a new voice, and all heads turned to see a distinguished gentleman in the uniform of a Scottish magistrate approaching with his own contingent of officers. "I am Magistrate Campbell, and I have warrants for the arrest of the Duke of Ravenshollow and Lord Edmund Blackthorn on charges of murder, theft and fraud." The battle was joined in earnest then, but it was a battle of law rather than swords. As the Duke and Edmund were taken into custody, their protests echoing across the Highland moors, Catherine felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had carried for so long she had forgotten what freedom felt like. "What happens now?" Mary asked, standing beside Catherine as they watched the Duke's party being led away. Catherine smiled, and for the first time in her life it was a smile of genuine happiness. "Now we begin again, all of us." But even as justice finally seemed within reach, Catherine knew that the Duke's influence extended far beyond the Scottish Highlands. Would the evidence be enough to convict him? And what new dangers awaited a young woman who had dared to challenge one of England's most powerful families? The trial of the Duke of Ravenshollow became the sensation of the 1888 London social season, drawing crowds to the Old Bailey that rivaled those attending the most popular theatrical productions. For 3 weeks, the courtroom was packed with peers of the realm, journalists and curious members of the public, all eager to witness the downfall of one of England's most powerful families. Catherine had returned to London for the proceedings, taking residence in the elegant Mayfair townhouse that had belonged to her mother's family, a property she had never known existed until Dr. Hartwell's investigations revealed the full extent of her inheritance. The house on Berkeley Square was a revelation in itself, filled with portraits of Sinclair ancestors and furnished with the quiet luxury that spoke of old money and older traditions. Standing before her mother's portrait in the morning room, Catherine marveled at how much they resembled each other. The same auburn hair, the same emerald eyes, the same determined set to the chin that spoke of Scottish stubbornness. But where her mother's painted expression held a gentle serenity, Catherine's reflection in the mirror showed a young woman who had been forged in the fires of adversity and emerged stronger than steel. "The newspapers are calling you the Highland heiress," Lady Moira observed, entering with the morning editions spread across a silver tray. "Though I must say, some of the coverage is rather sensationalized." Indeed, the press had seized upon the story with voracious appetite. Headlines screamed of murder most foul and the Duke's dark secret, while society columnists speculated endlessly about Catherine's romantic prospects now that her true fortune had been revealed. The fact that she had broken her engagement to Edmund Blackthorne only added fuel to the fire, with some papers painting her as a heartless fortune hunter, while others hailed her as a brave young woman who had escaped a terrible fate. "Let them write what they will," Catherine said, her voice carrying a confidence that would have been impossible just months before. "The truth is finally being told, and that's all that matters." The trial itself had been a masterpiece of legal theatre, with Dr. Hartwell presenting evidence with the precision of a surgeon and the passion of a crusader. Sarah Whitmore's testimony had been particularly devastating. Her simple, honest account of that terrible night, reducing several jury members to tears. The hidden compartment in the ring had yielded not only her mother's miniature will, but also a coded message that, when deciphered, revealed the location of additional evidence her mother had hidden. Edmund had attempted to maintain his innocence, claiming he had known nothing of his father's crimes. But under Dr. Hartwell's relentless cross-examination, his facade had crumbled like a house of cards. The revelation that he had been actively involved in forging documents and intimidating potential witnesses had shocked even those who had thought themselves beyond surprise. The Duke himself had remained defiant to the end, his aristocratic bearing never wavering even as the evidence mounted against him. But when the jury returned their verdict of guilty on all charges, something in his face had finally broken, and for the first time Catherine had seen him as what he truly was. Not a powerful nobleman, but a frightened old man who had built his life on lies and violence. Transportation to Australia, Lady Moira read from the newspaper account of the sentencing. 25 years of hard labour. Edmund received 15 years. I must say, Justice Pemberton was quite thorough in his condemnation. Catherine nodded, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but it could not bring back her parents or restore the 18 years of her life that had been stolen. Still, there was a certain poetic justice in the fact that the Duke, who had lived in luxury built on others' suffering, would spend his remaining years in the harsh conditions of a penal colony. "There's something else," Lady Moira said, her tone carefully neutral. "Dr. Hartwell has asked to see you this afternoon. He says there's a matter of some importance he wishes to discuss." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "More evidence? I thought we had uncovered everything." "Not evidence, my dear. Something rather more personal, I believe. Dr. James Hartwell arrived at precisely 3 o'clock, as punctual as always, but there was something different about his manner, a nervousness that seemed at odds with his usual composed demeanour. He was shown into the library, where Catherine waited among the leather-bound volumes that had belonged to generations of Sinclairs. "Lady Catherine," he began, then stopped, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture of uncertainty. "Forgive me, but I find myself in an unusual position." "Please sit," Catherine said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "And please call me Catherine. After everything we've been through together, surely we can dispense with excessive formality." He smiled at that, and Catherine was struck by how the expression transformed his serious features. Throughout the trial, she had come to appreciate not only his legal brilliance, but also his genuine compassion for those who had suffered injustice. He was perhaps 30 years old, with the kind of quiet strength that came from fighting battles for those who could not fight for themselves. "Catherine, then," he said, settling into the chair, "I wanted to speak with you about your future. Now that the trial is concluded and your inheritance is secure, you have choices to make about how you wish to live your life." "I've been thinking about that," Catherine admitted. For so long, my future was decided for me. Now that I can choose my own path, I find myself rather overwhelmed by the possibilities. There's something I'd like you to consider, James said, leaning forward slightly. I've been offered a position with the Crown Prosecution Service, working specifically on cases involving the abuse of power by those in positions of authority. It would mean travelling throughout England and Scotland, investigating cases where the wealthy and powerful have preyed upon the vulnerable. Catherine's eyes lit up with interest. That sounds like important work. It is, he agreed, but it would also be dangerous work. The kind of people we would be investigating don't hesitate to use violence to protect their secrets, as you well know. I would need someone with me who understands their world, someone who could move in society circles and gather information that might not be available through conventional means. You're asking me to be a spy, Catherine said, and there was amusement in her voice rather than shock. I'm asking you to be a partner, James said quietly. In every sense of the word. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Catherine studied his face, seeing the hope and uncertainty warring in his brown eyes. During the long weeks of preparation for the trial, she had come to know him as a man of absolute integrity, someone who fought for justice, not for personal gain, but because he genuinely believed in making the world a better place. James, she said softly, are you proposing to me? I'm proposing a partnership, he said carefully. A marriage of minds and hearts, if you'll have me. I know I'm not a duke or an earl. I have no title to offer you, no ancient estate or family fortune. But I can offer you a life of purpose, a chance to use your intelligence and resources to help others who have suffered as you have. Catherine rose from her chair and walked to the window overlooking Berkeley Square. Below, the fashionable world of London went about its business. Ladies in elegant carriages, gentlemen in perfectly tailored coats, servants hurrying about their duties. It was a world she had been born to, a world that would welcome her back now that her fortune was restored. But it was also a world that had nearly destroyed her, a world where power was often used to crush the innocent, and where justice was a luxury available only to those who could afford it. There's something you should know, she said, turning back to face him. I'm not the same person I was when I left Ravenshollow Manor. The frightened girl who would have accepted whatever fate was chosen for her is gone. In her place is someone who has learned that the only security worth having is the security that comes from being true to yourself. I'm counting on that, James said, rising to stand beside her. The work I'm proposing would require someone with courage, intelligence, and an absolute commitment to justice. I can think of no one better suited for it than you. Catherine looked into his eyes and saw not the calculating assessment she had grown accustomed to from men who viewed her as a prize to be won, but genuine respect and admiration for who she was as a person. Here was a man who valued her mind as much as her beauty, who saw her as an equal partner rather than a beautiful ornament. Yes, she said simply. Yes to the work, yes to the partnership, and yes to the marriage. If you're certain you want a wife who will never be content to sit quietly in drawing rooms while injustice flourishes around her. James's smile was radiant. I wouldn't have you any other way. Their engagement was announced quietly, without the fanfare that had surrounded her betrothal to Edmund. There were no grand balls or elaborate ceremonies, just a simple notice in the Times that spoke of a union based on mutual respect and shared purpose, rather than social advantage. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the small chapel at Glenmore Castle, with only their closest friends and allies in attendance. Sarah Whitmore and her family were there, no longer servants but honoured guests who had played a crucial role in bringing truth to light. Lady Moira served as matron of honour, her eyes bright with tears of joy as she watched her niece marry for love rather than obligation. Mary Whitmore, now Catherine's companion and friend rather than her servant, had been instrumental in planning the simple but elegant ceremony. The chapel was decorated with Highland heather and white roses, while Catherine wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her slender frame and updated with touches of Scottish lace that spoke of her heritage. As Catherine walked down the aisle on Lady Moira's arm, she thought of her parents and the love they had shared, cut short by greed and violence, but never truly destroyed. In choosing to marry James, she was honoring their memory by choosing love over convenience, purpose over privilege. The ceremony itself was brief but moving, with vows that spoke of partnership and equality rather than the traditional promises of obedience and submission. When James slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a woman who had fought for women's suffrage and social reform, Catherine felt as though she was not just gaining a husband, but joining a legacy of those who fought for justice. The reception was held in the castle's great hall, where the same room that had witnessed the revelation of the Duke's crimes now celebrated the beginning of a new chapter. The guests were an eclectic mix: legal reformers and social activists, Scottish clan members and English progressives, all united in their commitment to creating a more just society. As the evening wore on and the last guests departed, Catherine and James stood together on the castle battlements, looking out over the Highland moors that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The stars above seemed to shine with particular brilliance, as if the universe itself was celebrating their union. "Are you ready for what comes next?" James asked, his arm around her waist as they watched the moon rise over the mountains. "I've been ready my entire life," Catherine replied. "I just didn't know it, until now." In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the moors, the night express to London, carrying passengers toward their destinies. Soon, Catherine and James would board their own train, beginning their journey as partners in marriage and in the fight for justice. There would be dangers ahead, powerful enemies who would not hesitate to strike at those who threatened their comfortable corruption. But Catherine was no longer the frightened girl who had once cowered before the Duke's threats. She was a woman who had faced the worst that society could offer and emerged victorious, armed with truth, supported by love, and driven by an unshakable commitment to ensuring that others would not suffer as she had. The girl who had been trapped in a golden cage was gone forever. In her place stood a woman ready to soar. What new adventures awaited the Highland heiress and her crusading husband? And how many other victims of powerful predators would find hope in their partnership? 2 years had passed since Catherine Hartwell, she had chosen to take her husband's name as a symbol of their equal partnership, had walked down the aisle at Glenmore Castle. The autumn of 1890 found her standing in the drawing room of a modest but elegant house in Edinburgh's New Town, reviewing case files that would have made her former guardian's blood run cold. The house on Heriot Row had become the unofficial headquarters of what the newspapers had dubbed the Justice Partnership. The investigative team of Catherine and James Hartwell that had already brought down 3 corrupt magistrates exposed a network of child labour exploitation in the textile mills and secured the conviction of a baron who had been systematically defrauding his tenants. "The Pemberton case files have arrived from London," Mary Whitmore announced, entering with a leather satchel that had become as familiar as an old friend. Mary had evolved from servant to companion to trusted investigator, her keen intelligence and ability to move unnoticed through both servant halls and society drawing rooms, making her invaluable to their work. Catherine looked up from the correspondence she had been reviewing. Letters from victims across Britain who had heard of their work and were seeking help. Each letter represented a life damaged by those who believed their wealth and position placed them above the law, and each one strengthened her resolve to continue the fight her parents had died trying to begin. "Lord Pemberton's financial records?" Catherine asked, accepting the satchel. "I thought his solicitors were refusing to cooperate." "They were," Mary said with a satisfied smile, until Dr. Hartwell reminded them that obstruction of justice carries its own penalties. Amazing how cooperative people become when faced with the prospect of sharing a cell with their clients. The transformation in Mary over the past 2 years had been remarkable. No longer the frightened servant girl who had risked everything to speak truth to power, she had blossomed into a confident young woman whose sharp wit and fearless determination made her a formidable investigator. She had also caught the attention of Inspector Morrison from Scotland Yard, whose frequent visits to Edinburgh were ostensibly professional, but whose lingering glances at Mary suggested more personal motivations. "Any word from James?" Catherine asked, settling into her chair by the window that overlooked the elegant Georgian square. Her husband had been in Glasgow for the past week, investigating reports of unsafe working conditions in the shipyards, conditions that were killing workers while enriching their employers. "He sent word this morning," Mary replied, producing a telegram from her pocket. "The shipyard owners have agreed to implement safety measures rather than face prosecution. He'll be home tomorrow evening." Catherine smiled, feeling the familiar warmth that thoughts of her husband always brought. Their marriage had exceeded even her most optimistic expectations, proving that a union based on mutual respect and shared purpose could be both passionate and practical. James treated her as an equal partner in every sense, valuing her insights and trusting her judgment in ways that would have scandalized the society she had once been expected to join. Their work together had taken them from the drawing rooms of Mayfair to the slums of Manchester, from the coal mines of Wales to the fishing villages of Scotland. They had learned to move seamlessly between worlds, Catherine using her aristocratic connections to gain access to information, while James employed his legal expertise to ensure that justice was served. "There's something else," Mary said, her tone becoming more serious. "A letter arrived this morning from Australia. It's about the Duke." Catherine's hand stilled on the case files. News from the penal colony where her former guardian was serving his sentence was rare and never welcome. "What about him?" "He's dead," Mary said simply. "Died of fever 3 months ago, according to the prison authorities. They thought you should know." Catherine sat in silence for a long moment, processing the news. She had expected to feel satisfaction, perhaps even joy, at learning of the Duke's death. Instead, she felt only a profound sadness for the waste of it all, the lives destroyed, the potential squandered, the decades of suffering that could have been avoided if one man had chosen honor over greed. "And Edmund?" she asked quietly. "Still alive, apparently. The letter mentions that he's been assigned to work in the prison library. Seems he's learned to read and write properly for the first time in his life." There was irony in that. Edmund Blackthorne, who had been born to every privilege, finally receiving an education in the harsh confines of a penal colony. Catherine wondered if he had learned anything beyond literacy in his years of imprisonment, if he had gained any understanding of the pain he had helped inflict. "I think," Catherine said slowly, "that chapter of our lives is finally closed." A knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts, followed by the sound of their housekeeper, Mrs. MacLeod, greeting a visitor. Moments later, the drawing-room door opened to admit a young woman Catherine didn't recognize, perhaps 20 years old, with dark hair and frightened blue eyes that reminded Catherine painfully of her own younger self. "Lady Catherine," Mrs. MacLeod announced, "this is Miss Elizabeth Thornfield. She says she needs your help urgently." Catherine rose immediately, her professional instincts taking over. "Please, Miss Thornfield, sit down. Mary, would you ask Mrs. MacLeod to bring tea and perhaps something to eat? You look as though you've travelled far." Indeed, the young woman's travelling dress was wrinkled and dusty, her gloves worn thin, and her face bore the exhausted pallor of someone who had been running on desperation rather than rest. As she settled into the chair, Catherine indicated her hands trembled slightly. Whether from fatigue, fear, or cold, it was impossible to say. "I've come from Yorkshire," Elizabeth said, her voice barely above a whisper. "From Thornfield Hall. I've heard about your work, about how you help people who have nowhere else to turn." "We try," Catherine said gently, settling into the chair across from her visitor. "Tell me what's happened." The story that emerged over the next hour was depressingly familiar, yet uniquely horrifying. Elizabeth Thornfield was the daughter of a wealthy industrialist who had built his fortune on textile mills throughout northern England. When her father had died 6 months earlier, control of the business had passed to her uncle, Sir Reginald Thornfield, a man whose cruelty toward his workers was matched only by his treatment of his own family. "He's forcing me to marry his business partner," Elizabeth said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Mr. Grimsby is 60 years old and has already buried 2 wives under suspicious circumstances, but Uncle Reginald says the marriage will secure important contracts for the mills." "And if you refuse?" Mary asked, having returned with the tea service. Elizabeth's laugh was bitter. "He's made it clear that refusal isn't an option. He controls my inheritance until I marry or turn 25, and he's threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent if I don't comply. He has a doctor who will swear to anything for the right price." Catherine felt a familiar fire kindle in her chest, the same righteous anger that had sustained her through her own ordeal and driven her to dedicate her life to helping others. Here was another young woman, trapped by the very laws that were supposed to protect her, another victim of men who viewed women as property to be traded for profit. "There's more," Elizabeth continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The workers at the mills, they're dying. Uncle Reginald has been using cheaper materials, cutting safety measures, forcing people to work in conditions that would kill animals. When they complain, they're dismissed without pay or reference. When they try to organize, they simply disappear." "Disappear?" Catherine asked sharply. "Bodies found in the river, accidents that aren't accidents, families who pack up and leave in the middle of the night after visits from Uncle Reginald's men. The local magistrate is in his pocket, the police look the other way, and anyone who speaks out is silenced." Catherine and Mary exchanged glances. This was exactly the kind of case they had been created to handle. Powerful men using their wealth and influence to commit crimes with impunity, secure in the knowledge that their victims had no recourse to justice. "Miss Thornfield," Catherine said formally, "I want you to know that you are safe here. No one will force you into any marriage, and no one will harm you while you're under our protection. But I need to ask, are you prepared for what fighting your uncle will mean? Men like Sir Reginald don't surrender their power easily." Elizabeth's blue eyes blazed with sudden fire. "Lady Catherine, I've watched my uncle destroy everything my father built, seen him turn our mills into death traps for the sake of profit. I've seen families torn apart, children orphaned, women widowed. Also, he can add a few more pounds to his already obscene fortune. If you can help me stop him, I'll do whatever it takes." "Then we'll help you," Catherine said simply. "Mary, send word to James that we have a new case, and wire Inspector Morrison. We'll need Scotland Yard's assistance for this one." Over the following days, Catherine threw herself into the investigation with the focused intensity that had made her reputation. Elizabeth proved to be an invaluable source of information, having spent months documenting her uncle's crimes while pretending to be the compliant niece he expected her to be. The evidence was damning. Forged safety inspections, bribed officials, workers paid in company scrip that kept them perpetually in debt, and a pattern of accidents that eliminated troublemakers with suspicious regularity. But Sir Reginald Thornfield was no mere country squire. He was a man with connections reaching into Parliament itself, protected by a network of corruption that would require careful dismantling. James returned from Glasgow energized by their new case, bringing with him Inspector Morrison and a team of investigators who had been quietly gathering evidence against Sir Reginald for months. The dining room of the Heriot Row house was transformed into a war room, with maps of the Thornfield mills, financial records, and witness statements covering every available surface. "The key," James explained during one of their strategy sessions, is to move simultaneously on multiple fronts. If we give him time to destroy evidence or silence witnesses, we'll lose everything. I can get you inside the main mill, Elizabeth offered. There's a board meeting next week where Uncle Reginald plans to announce my engagement to Mr. Grimsby. If I can delay that announcement, create some kind of distraction. Absolutely not, Catherine said firmly. You're not going back there. It's too dangerous. With respect, Lady Catherine, Elizabeth replied, her chin lifting with familiar stubbornness. This is my fight. These are my mills, my workers, my family's legacy that he's destroying. I won't hide in safety while others do the dangerous work. Catherine saw herself in the young woman's determination, the same refusal to be protected while others suffered, the same need to take an active role in fighting injustice. It was a quality she recognized and respected, even as it terrified her. Then we do it together, Catherine said finally, but we do it smart, and we do it safe. The plan they developed was audacious in its scope and timing. While Elizabeth returned to Thornfield Hall to play her role as the dutiful niece, Catherine would use her social connections to gather intelligence from Sir Reginald's business associates. James and Inspector Morrison would coordinate with local authorities who could be trusted, while Mary would infiltrate the mills themselves, posing as a worker seeking employment. As the pieces of their plan fell into place, Catherine felt the familiar thrill of the hunt, the satisfaction of using her intelligence and resources to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. This was the life she had chosen, the path she had carved out of the ashes of her own suffering. Standing in her study late one evening, reviewing the final details of their operation, Catherine caught sight of her reflection in the darkened window. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the frightened girl who had once cowered before the Duke's threats. This woman had steel in her spine and fire in her eyes, tempered by experience and strengthened by purpose. Tomorrow, they would begin the final phase of their investigation into Sir Reginald Thornfield. Within a week, if all went according to plan, another corrupt tyrant would face justice, and dozens of innocent workers would be free from his oppression. But even as Catherine prepared for the battle ahead, she knew that this case would not be their last. Somewhere in Britain, other young women were trapped in golden cages. Other workers were dying for their employers' profits. Other victims were crying out for justice that seemed forever beyond their reach. And as long as such injustices existed, Catherine Hartwell would be there to fight them, armed with truth, supported by love, and driven by the unshakable conviction that no one, no matter how wealthy or powerful, was above the law. The Highland heiress had found her true calling, and she would never stop fighting for those who needed her voice. What new revelations would their investigation uncover, and how far would Sir Reginald go to protect his empire of exploitation? If you've been captivated by Catherine's journey from trapped heiress to fearless crusader for justice, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of courage, redemption, and triumph over adversity. Share this tale with someone who needs to hear that no cage, no matter how golden, can contain a spirit determined to be free. And tell us in the comments, what injustice in your own world would you fight to change if you had Catherine's courage and resources? Until next time, remember that sometimes the most powerful weapon against tyranny is simply refusing to remain silent.